evening and welcome. This is the October presentation. Again, it's another interesting topical one. It's on Sustainable Development Goal 9, Industry, Innovation and Infrastructure. Topical because the current UK setting, and of course the round the world setting around infrastructure agendas, is hitting the news headlines. And people are responding to it, both as producers and consumers, with some challenge to personal lives and also to manufacturing and industry. So again, a topical presentation, and I'm going to ask Bert to start the PowerPoint.
Okay, just bear with me, Clive.
Okay, can we go to full screen?
There we go.
Thank you very much. So October 2022, SDG 9, Industry, Innovation and Infrastructure. Next one, please. Our mantra in our presentations is to inform, educate and promote change. And the challenge for ourselves when we're looking at this is that if it's not you, then who? If it's not now, then when? And if it's not you who can, then who will? So those who are able and in a position of strength, if they aren't able to make the changes that's required, then who can? Next one. Okay, the agenda for tonight. So when I started thinking about this session, it became obvious that it's an encompassing goal, as most are, but it speaks directly to the current political debate about growth and development. And we've heard, certainly in the UK and around the world, that growth is a key feature of political and economic agendas. So that's what we're dealing with tonight. But I'll also refer to some of the concepts of the ideas of growth versus the ideas of development, because some way there's a pathway that sometimes is seen by some as contra the other. We'll look at industry and infrastructure, obviously, and the drivers of growth and development. And I'm picking up aspects of the food and water, shelter, energy, transport, and ICT. And those are the key features of life in our modern world, where they are interdependent, but also we are dependent on them being there for us. Even in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need to have food and water, we need to have shelter, and we need to have energy in our modern worlds. We'll look at the changing and emerging political influences across the world, and that's over time, where control of infrastructure, both in our country in terms of the UK, but also across the world, has been, there's been an evolution over the last 100 or so years. And then I'll finish with a local case study on trying to do something in a local Lincolnshire area. Following that, our roundtable discussion will take us forward. Thank you, Bert. If we look at the SDGs, there's these 17 goals there. Number 9 talks about industry, education, industry and innovation, infrastructure. And of course, if you press the next one, Bert, please, you'll see that I keep referring to this sustainable goals as rather like I was going to say a tin of soup, bearing in mind what happened with the tin of soup in an art gallery recently. A tin of soup has lots of ingredients, and within SDG 9, you'll see the impact of how this is done, how we develop industry and innovation in all sorts of ways that relate to all the other 16 goals. So the ingredients of this are multivarious, but of course, we're going to focus on some more particular ones. Thank you, Bert. Next one. The UN came out with a statement that talks about a functioning and resilient infrastructure is the foundation of every successful community. I think they talked about the fact that if you do not have infrastructure for the modern world, then communities break down. We see the issues around oil and issues around gas in our world at the moment, and that's a topical challenge. We see the issues around food and the ways in which food is both produced and distributed. So unless you have resilient infrastructure, then that you don't really get successful communities at all levels and stages of development. And to meet the future challenges, our industries need to be upgraded, and that's every area. But if we're going to upgrade our industries and infrastructure, then it talks about the third line down there. We need to provide innovative, sustainable technologies. And what I suppose we mean by that is that we consider the environment and climate and biodiversity and how we access and use and distribute resources. And then the last sentence there talks about bringing prosperity, creating jobs, etc. But of course, in terms of prosperity, I suppose it could be talked about as being income per head. But of course, that denies the aspect about the distribution of income per head. Or is it about better quality or more goods and services per person? And there's a question about what we mean by that, which leads on to the questioning about what is it meant by economic growth or economic development. Okay, Bert, next one, please. Some of you may be familiar with this if you've studied economics anywhere, and I'll go slowly through this so that it gives us a basis for our conversation. This is what we refer to as the circular flow of income. And if we think about the blue circle in the middle, you've got goods and services. So when people talk about economic growth, they're talking about the number of goods and services available in any community or around the world. So if there are more goods, if there's more food, if there's more cars, if there's more televisions, if there's more doctors, if there's more nurses, if there's more educational staff, if there are more lawyers, more solicitors, whatever we're talking about that provide goods and services, if there's more of them for households, then we argue, or it's argued, that we are better off, we have growth. Of course, in the real economy again, the goods and services are produced, if you look at the bottom, by people who work, labor, that work on land which incorporates all aspects of resources, from tin and metals to water to agricultural land, to all aspects of those things which are called factors of production. And the capital is the machinery that's referred to, that are the elements of production from the past that has given equipment to improve the production. And there's a lot of people talking about capital intensity in countries where more capital has led to better production capability, not least the fact that they're all of ICT, information and communication technology, in all aspects about production, and increasing the efficiency of production. Now, if that's the real economy in the middle, that's what we live by, and our houses are full of the goods and services, and we receive them. There's a flow of money, and the outside line represents the flows of money. So if we buy things, if we're households and we spend money, we spend it on firms, or we give it to firms. Firms, by and large, in this model here, are the people or the organizations that use the labor and the land and the capital. They own some of that, but also they pay for it. If you rent a building, you're going to be paying for the capital that the building is. If you rent machinery, if you rent land, you're going to be paying for the land that for the owners of the land, which might be households. So wages, rent, interest, and then profits. And profits is the surplus produced over and above the cost of production. So your flow of money is the counterflow to the goods and services and use of factors. And of course, in our modern world, we're talking about the use of government spending to produce goods and services. So they come from the taxes, which are the red flow out to the right. And of course, government spending comes in from the left. And the great debate in the UK at the moment is the excess between what you bring in terms of taxes and what you spend in terms of government spending. And if you don't spend more than you bring in, you create a surplus. If you plan to spend more than you bring in taxes, in whatever form, you've got a deficit. And that's where governments have to borrow. But of course, then there's the investment from the private firms and savings that people have and firms have. There's imports and exports. They represent the flows of money within our world. And of course, the whole notion of this is that if we're talking about growth, what people generally talk about is the value, the monetary value of the output of goods and services. So it's measured largely through the spending on goods and services in a money form. So that's growth. Next one, Bert, please. Now, when we talk about that circular flow, what we realize in our world is that there's lots of things that happen that would never be counted. Some countries in the world have approximations for these things in their circular flow, but we don't. So grandparents looking after a grandchild would not be counted in that flow. If you paid for a childcare person, it would be counted. If you grow your own vegetables from seeds you've got from last year, it's not counted in that flow. If you buy some vegetables from a shop, it will be. If you go for a run in the fresh air, go out your front door and run around the fields or run around the roads or run around the block, it would not be counted. If you go for a session in a gym that you pay, it would be counted. If you volunteer to support a community food bank, again, it wouldn't be counted. If you work in a shop or behind a bar, then it would be counted. You're paid to do that. It's part of that circular flow. And again, we know in our world that there are lots of things that happen between people where jobs get done. So jobs completed by others, that form of the mate rate economy. I'll do it for you and you do this for me. We swap. It doesn't count. It's not part of the flow of goods and services. So you could have technically economic growth happening by all of those things multiplying and multiplying, and it would never be seen as economic growth in the books that the government runs. Next one, Bert, please. So on the left there, you've got economic growth, an increase in real gross domestic product. The reason why they put real there is that they sometimes put an inflation adjustment in this so that year by year you can have real comparisons. And it talks about a higher national income or higher national output. So that's what people talk about in terms of growth. But of course, if you have growth, does it mean necessarily development? Does it mean you got an increase in living standards? So if you've got economic growth and the benefits of the growth goes to a small proportion of your population, does it mean your living standards have all risen? Does it mean that there's an increase in educational standards? Because the future, in terms of development for growth, requires an educated workforce. Will it mean improved healthcare, improved infrastructure, or, for example, diversification of an economy as time progresses and we seek to move into other areas? So economic development is a different concept from economic growth. And it seems to me in terms of industry and infrastructure, they're involved in the second part of economic development, as well as they are involved with the notions of economic growth. So if economic growth is going to be increased by industry and infrastructure, they will talk about that as being through capital intensification. It means that you get more for what you put in. You're more efficient in what you do. But in terms of economic development, there's some development issues there that in terms of living standards or better place to live, where, for example, we could have a massive rise in oil production in the UK through exploitation of what's left in the North Sea or fracking for gas. But nevertheless, there's an issue there about development that might mean we are worse off in terms of our living conditions through environmental degradation. So development and growth are interesting concepts that we need to just get our heads around. Next one, please. In the previous presentations, we've talked about the donut economy. And of course, that says, how do you grow within your means? And of course, there's two aspects about this. Kate Raworth, who mentions this, talks about the shortfall agenda, how you make sure the social foundation of development is there. So is there correct proportions of the inside elements there, which are, as you see, very closely aligned with SDGs. Are you, water, energy, food, health, education, peace and justice? All those things being promoted and provided for within your economy? And are you operating within the ecological ceiling? Are you doing this so you do not overshoot and cause your children's children to be in a worse position than we are? Okay, so the whole notion of development is being challenged by another framework there that says it's not just about growth, it's actually about growth within an ecological ceiling. Next one, please, Bert. Across the world, there are people living in all manner of places which are beautiful. This is Lesotho, and you'll see the basalt injection there that comes out, forms around Lesotho, those small mountains, which reflects the hats that if you go to Lesotho, there's the traditional hat that the Lesothans wear, which reflects the type of terrain that's around there. And I was there some while ago, and an interesting poem I put together whilst I was there. And it says, I said to Papama, who was someone I was staying with, would you have a car and drive it to work for a mile? Oh, yes, I would, she replied. And I said, the roads are so bumpy. Would you want roads flat and tarred? If you look at the bumpy road there, that's fine. But in the rainy season, when it comes, it becomes a mud track. And of course, if you don't get it graded by the grading machine, it washes away and you have huge tracks of holes in it. So I want roads flat and tarred. Oh, yes, I'd like that, of course, she said. And would you like wide roads with white lines and footpaths so your children are safe? Now, Papama had been to Maseru, the capital, and seen these things. And this is the rural area. And she said, yes, we'd like that. And I said, would you drive fast on the flat road so you get to work in a minute? And we were taking about a mile. And of course, a mile takes about 15 minutes to walk through that lovely countryside. And I'm looking at this thinking, why would I want to drive there in a minute? And so she said, yes. And by the school, I said, the schools are the cars that are so fast, it would not safe to cross the road. She replied, who needs speed bumps then? Of course. And of course, if you go to cities in Africa, you have speed bumps. So you go from a notion of desires and expectations there that said, I'd like to have these things. But of course, there's an interesting, for myself, observing that, a juxtaposition that said, well, is that really development? The fact you can walk through beautiful countryside to get to work and see the fresh air, as opposed to having cars chasing up down and having to be slowed down by, what's called sleeping policemen or speed bumps. Interesting about growth and development. Next one, please, Bert. The concept of development is in economics relatively new, because most of the time in the past it's been about how you produce, supply and demand, and how you get industry going. But certainly in this the latter part of the last century and into this century, there's the idea that there ought to be development. There's a kind of a given that there is the modern world and there are the developing countries. So one idea to really just to put this into a nutshell, modernization said that the poor should emulate developed countries. So in the past, massive amounts of aid were poured into countries to make them like us. They wanted the same things. So industry went in, you put in, and if you think about even in the last years, how China has massively expanded and the amount of work that it's done to produce energy through coal. And of course, most countries in the world said, if we have energy, we can actually do things beyond what we've done in the past. Well, there are interesting conflicts in this. We'll come back down to later about who allows that technology to move and how you can own it, even if it's gone to another country. The notion of dependency, well, there's a concept there that said, well, the poor nations or the poor parts of the world will never catch up with developed countries because they keep leapfrogging ahead. So on the basis of that, they'll continue to require assistance and support. Say, well, who's that from? Is it support through aid or infrastructure development? And I will talk about that a bit later on. But certainly over the last century, there's been interesting developments of multinationals that have gone into countries to provide that. and aid and support has created dependencies amongst developing countries with developed countries. The notion of neoliberalism, which came forward certainly in the last 60 years, was really to say, well, how do you let the market operate to cure all the ills? So if you have globalization, but of course, when they talk about that, it's the free flow, both of resources, of businesses, of trade. And of course, if you go to the extreme with the neoliberalism, is about the movement of people. And then you think, well, how do we deal with that in the context of developing countries and war and famine and the notion of globalization? So there are, limits to what goes on there. But of course, the idea was that if you free markets up, then it will solve the problems. Now, those might be how you get things to happen, but the bottom ones really are about the alternate things that are in there. So, well, if we want to develop a country, or if a country wants to develop, should it follow the route of the West or the developed nations? Are there alternate routes? Are there different things that indigenous communities around the world would say will be better for us? And that's an interesting challenge. So if you go to Brazil and look at the issues in Brazil and the indigenous peoples there, they've seen massive change happen through the deforestation and the imposition of farms for beef. And of course, that's grown their income for those that are involved in it. But of course, the indigenous people aren't part of that. Very often they are marginalized and pushed away. So the whole notion of participation came in, but of course, of participative development. And fundamentally, it was saying, even at the level of the IMF or the international development agencies, going into a place saying, you will have this because it's good for you, may not be the appropriate development for that particular stage and place. One particular example of that is with, and we've heard about water previously, but some parts of the world where there was poor water supply, water for many small communities in developing parts of Africa is not just water for drinking and cleaning and washing. There's an example given where a water company from the West went into a place and built a new water well to provide them with the water they needed for their village by drilling down into the ground. It was very rarely used 4 months later, because the notion of collecting water from the streams and the river down the road that took 20 minutes to walk to was what the people that did the washing and sorting out actually wanted to do. So the notion of collecting water was a social agenda. It wasn't just turning a tap on. So the whole notion of how you see development happening, you can't just translate from one to the other and say, this is how it should be. Development as well-being. If you go to Bhutan, and if you look at all the information from there, they are strictly staying with the notion that happiness, and they have a well-being happiness concept, which others are looking at. And it says, let's measure development differently, and let's bear in mind that we are people on a planet with a sustainable future we're looking at. And so happiness is about, the concept of being now and into the future, but also around relationship agendas. And of course, then the last one I'll put up there is the concepts that Sen, Amartya Sen, who's an Indian economist, talks about. You can have development as long as for people they are given and offered the opportunity to gain capabilities to be participative in our world, and the opportunities are presented for them. So your freedom concept is that, yes, I can grow, I can develop, I can become something, I can participate, and I can self-direct, I can be an autonomous being within a community or within a country and within a world. And so the concept of freedom, when you think about freedom as development, begs questions about the nature of how individuals and organizations work together, or governments work in the concept of freedom. So development as freedom is both political and it's an economic concept. Okay, thanks for that. That's the notion of development and growth. Next one, Bert, please. Which takes on to the SDG 9 and development of industry. So you've got key industries infrastructure for economies and individuals worldwide. You've got food and water. These are Maslow's agendas, really, aren't they? Food and water, shelter, energy, and then more recently in our world, transport and information and communication technology. That's the areas we'll focus on for a moment. And of course, in my lifetime, when you think about the notion of those things there, we were talking briefly before we started the presentation on culture and backgrounds. But when I was growing up, there was a town gas supply owned by a town gas company. Globalization, as we said before, has changed that. We now have natural gas, and some of our natural gas in Europe comes from Russia, or used to come from Russia, or would come from other parts of the world via tankers. So the whole notion of big industry and big business and infrastructure is a very topical, but also a very crucial part of development now. Next one, please, Bert. If we go to food, and I was meeting with a farmer not so long ago and saying to him, well, what is it that's happening with the food industry at the moment? Because it's all kind of gone crazy. The price of potatoes, the price of grain, the escalation, and of course, both there's a political development internationally around that, but also in terms of even looking at this, in terms of the demand or the average food consumption and the projected food consumption, when you look at it in terms of globalization, there are about 4 grain traders control the grain market for the world, and they're forecasting demand to outstrip supply till 2024. So when you ask farmers again about supply of machinery or the stuff that they use to make and grow the products, there's only about 4 or 5 suppliers for them. So what you have happened in my lifetime is that increasingly there's been a domination of that market and that provision through big business, who are then in charge of the machinery through which it is produced, and the controls, the standards of the products that are made. Next one, Bert, please. These are the headlines which I just picked out very briefly. Thames Water tops league table for highest number of complaints. 16th of October this month. Anglian Water fined 1.2 for causing pollution, 18th of October this month. Britain takes water for granted and we're heading towards a crisis. There's the challenge of supply, storage, distribution, and ownership, control, and regulation. So in terms of infrastructure, when we take water, well, why is it this is the case? And of course, the complaints are about water leakages. Anglian Water is about pollution. We hear of water companies regularly who are trying to make or improve the pipework, which goes back some generations. But of course, it's not just the pipework that's there for supply of water, it's also the ways in which those that use water are using the outcome from using water, the pollution from sewage and drains. And of course, if you lived in Lincolnshire recently, you will see a massive issue around flooding in Market Raisin, when flow off from the water from the streets, in particular, an economic development of a massive car park may have contributed towards the flooding of a town. So in terms of the water challenges, they will continue to be there. That's UK. But of course, internationally, there's also a challenge for water. And so around the world, how you deal with that through new infrastructure or new changes around the world. The companies that are involved are multinational companies. In terms of the ownership and control of water companies, I'm given to believe that at one time the Teachers' Pension Fund of Canada were the owners of Yorkshire Water, supplying water to the Yorkshire area of the country. So of course, if there are shareholders there that own the water that are non-UK, It's the same around the world. So water supply around the world is also controlled by significant international global companies. Next one, please, Bert. New infrastructure. This was a picture I took in near Kumbu, which is pronounced Umbu with a click, in South Africa in 2004. A very significant project on participative development. It was a water supply to a village that previously had a river and a lake upstream from where they lived, up in the mountain, and donkeys used to carry the water down. And people used to take the water off the donkeys and it moved down through the village. They would move down through the village. And this was an opportunity funded by SVA, Sustainable Villages in Africa. It was funded by the Dutch government and others, and they engaged the local people to form a committee. They're involved in the work in building the infrastructure to provide the water supply. And it had been just slightly on the back of the fact that they put in a very mediocre electricity supply that could assist with pumping. Interestingly enough, that not only had the electricity got there for pumping, but it suddenly became possible to use a phone. And this is 2004, when things are very different in South Africa. And they put Vodacom all around the country. So in the middle of the village was a porter cabin with a charging point for phones where you could go and use a mobile phone. So this water was dug, and they produced it, and the idea was to build a network of homesteads where they would have water supply and they could grow 2 or 3 crops a year. It worked. However, roll forward to about 2011, who were the beneficiaries of this water supply? Well, those who had the first access to the water in their homesteads. Others didn't have the same access. So a distribution agenda once the infrastructure was there, which caused unrest. The payment for the pumping of the water was a community charge, and then they got behind on the bill, so the electricity was turned off on the pumps. So the water didn't flow. So in terms of, you have a bright project, you make it work, and then infrastructure kind of breaks down because of the people's agenda and disquiet. Pleasingly, I'm aware that a turbine has been put in, a wind turbine has been put in to provide electricity, and this is now working again. So there are challenges, even with introducing infrastructure in a participative way. Next one, please, Bert. Interesting in terms of housing. The world needs to build more than 2 billion new homes in the next 80 years, World Economic Forum. If you think about how you build a house and where it is placed, and of course that means 2 billion pieces of land. And if you look at the world at the moment and you carve the land up by who owns it and who wants to share it, a challenging thought. Housing costs, the housing crisis could input 1.6 billion by 2025, but the shortage of land, lending, labour and materials are some of the factors. And of course, what we observe around the world in terms of housing and land and property is that international investors, those who have wealth, see housing as a safe option for investment income in all major cities and safe places. So if you look at London, they tell me that on data shows 28,000 homes are owned by Chinese, external to the UK. We know of many houses in London which are owned by Russians, and increasingly in the last period of time there's been investment in those around how we pay the rent to those who own it from abroad. And of course that's not just in the UK, but my son tells me that in New Zealand through the COVID period, a safe place to be. Suddenly massive amounts of money poured into New Zealand in order that people have a safe place to be. House prices rapidly rose. Next one, please. But going on to energy, And you think about the nature of energy, and there's a forecast of energy consumption through to 2040. And of course, when you think about infrastructure and pipelines and transportation, energy is a massive consumer of investment because it has a massive return. And if you look at the 7 major companies that control the overall production of fossil energy, and there are a few international investors whose ambitions influence the production and distribution. We are all, in terms of economic growth or economic development, dependent on an energy supply. And of course, when you look at the world at the moment and the uncertainties in the world, there's a massive agenda there about how you effectively move both from fossil fuels to renewables. But of course, in the short term, the costs of that for organizations and the cost of it for individuals is phenomenal. A challenge for ourselves to make differences over the next period of time for our children's children. Next one, please. Just checking out other things in terms of what we do: transport, innovation and development. The 14 major global corporations control more than 60% of automotive brands. And then you look at if you are an automotive, lorry or a car, you got to drive it with a fuel: petrol, diesel, hydrogen, electricity. And again, there are a very small number of suppliers, and the infrastructure to provide those is also well controlled. So you need the infrastructure for all sorts of deliveries to make those things happen, to make the transport work. I've put down there in terms of production locations, and you think about it now, 33% of all cars are made in China. Not just because they have a massive population, but because they also are exporting and in partnership with many others. If you read the news recently, you will see that BMW are moving the Mini production to China, and the same way there's a deal being dealt with between VW and China. So innovation and development in terms of industry and infrastructure. China and smart motorways, they are talking now about motorways potentially, and in other parts of the world, which are the sort that will actually allow solar panels to operate on motorways so that cars can operate and recharge from the energy produced by the road surface. They're talking in China at the moment also of cars which levitate, and therefore if you're frictionless, you lose less energy in moving. New developments, new innovations, and again, there's things there where you could possibly talk about as being the sustainable way forward. Next one, Bert, please. In Nairobi last month, the president said there needs to be global efforts in enhancing ICT, and the world needs greater investment to support it and the deployment. And it's an infrastructure which is not the same as the infrastructure around building pipes in the ground, but nevertheless it has connectivity and bringing to partnership all those things required to make things happen. He talked about heads of state. He called for a stronger global partnership to enhance ICT and to bridge the yawning digital divide between the global south and the rest of the world. You put the next picture up, Bert, and you can see the world map of development, and it's the penetration internet users as a percent of the population in 2019. And if you look at it in terms of the developed nations, but then you look at the other parts of the world, it's not quite the same. And so if you want to change things, then it needs to happen. I talked about the Vodacom in South Africa. We could talk about the use of internet as being a force for democracy, that technology allows information to flow. But of course, in terms of democracy, there are ways in which internet connections and media can influence all sorts of things, which also begs a question about how you train people both in usage and abuse and non-abuse of internet agendas. Thank you, Bert. Internet and development is a massive topic, but it also ties into financial tech or fintech, or the notion of non-hard currencies. you're talking about Bitcoin or other types of currencies, and you'll find out that internet and the development of that is allowing cryptocurrencies to grow all around the world. And one of the challenges now is that once you have that development in terms of an infrastructure for trade, it can also become a tied infrastructure for trade. So who controls the internet and the provision of that is another topic. At the moment, there are significant moves from China to develop a currency that they offer support to parts of Africa and African nations with, which is the currency that China has created. So when you put in aid or development, it has to be paid back through the same mechanisms through to China. It creates the culture of ownership of the trade activity. Okay, next one, please, Bert. Okay, and this is where we take on to the bit about the political agendas. This is a map of Africa, you can see, and if you look down the list more carefully on the screen there, if I just read out a couple of things. 19% of the investment from China is in oil and gas, 18% in rail and road, and then iron and copper, and then civil construction. I can remember that in my visit to Lesotho, I got on the plane from Johannesburg to Maseru, and on the plane, a small 30-seater, some 24 people on the plane were Chinese. And when I got off the plane and asked the driver that picked me up to say, well, what's going on here? He said, well, the Chinese came to Lesotho to help build a new government building. They brought their engineers and designers. They brought the laborers to work. And of course, what followed then was all the people that wanted to supply the Chinese workforce with Chinese products and food. The building was built, the engineers left, but the population remained, and they are now running shops in Lesotho, in Maseru, and other places. China, at the same time as that process happened, saw the opportunity to develop industry over there. So there are new textile companies in Lesotho run by Chinese making, for example, Levi jeans. So to supply to America, because America had a trading arrangement with Lesotho as a less developed country. So what you have is the flow into a country from a country now, whereas if you go back historically, the Europe had controlled most of the access and egress of goods and services and people and development of Africa. So historically things have changed. And of course, the concept of development is in whose interest. And of course, when you think that there are lots of tied agendas there, where China will go in and try and influence for its benefit as well as the country's benefit. If you take a bigger picture, you'll see the Chinese Belt and Road framework around transport right the way through to Europe. So again, politically, growth, infrastructure and development are tied up with the economic in the locality where the development is taking place. The last point on Lesotho is that if you do look at some of the schools over there, the young people are learning Chinese. They are learning Chinese. So interestingly, in terms of what it is we teach kids and for what purposes. Lastly, we're going to go to Lincolnshire. And this is an opportunity. Next one, please, Bert. An opportunity in a small village to make a difference. That's the village. That was when the snow fell, and we tried to think about something different. Off you go. Next one, Bert. So a presentation to the local parish council. We need to do something. CO2 emissions have changed. And I had a conversation with a neighbour during lockdown in 2020. I was an engineer, and I said, can we do something around supply of energy to Bigby? And he said, well, let's have a go. Next bit, please. So we applied for funding. We got our consultants appointed. We managed to get about £40,000 from the BEIS in the UK. Look at this new innovation. Site visit, fortnightly Zoom meetings, and our consideration for energy generation, our usage, our risk reward matrix, and management arrangements. We were seeking to find ways of perhaps even building a community interest company to supply. Next one, please, Bert. We found a farmer who said, yes, we have some land here, which is ex-gravel pit land. Yes, we can make a difference. We can build a solar farm. The solar farm, originally we planned for Bigby, was about 2 football pitches worth. That would supply Bigby. But suddenly we had 54 hectares. When they did the calculations, Arup considered it and thought, wow, we could potentially have something like 50 megawatts of power. 50 megawatts of power will supply 25,000 homes. And our current energy usage costs, that's a lot of money could come in. Next one, please, Bert. So we asked them to think about what we could do. So PV photovoltaic, anaerobic digestion could be a source of energy, wind, battery storage, photovoltaic to hydrogen. And because it's on a hot spot, it could be a water source. By pumping water into the ground, it comes back about 60 degrees. You could have a water source heat. And of course, then what can you use it with? Well, private wires to companies. We could produce ammonia. You could put a data center there. You could talk about community. You could put glass houses there. You could talk about vertical growing. There's a garden center nearby that you could use for glass houses, a new rail office, an airport, a quarry, possibly even aquaponics, produce fish and shrimp. But the red point there points out no access to the grid. The biggest challenge when there's no access to the grid is where do you get your reliable annual income from that would pay the cost of putting things together? Where do you get your return from if you can't use a grid? Very difficult. And then when you start to lift the stones, what we realized was that although there are grid connections nearby, the licensing agreement in the UK says for our infrastructure, unless there's a significant demand in the area where the electricity is produced, the licensing agreement prohibits them from building a wire to it. Again, it limits the input of the electricity, the green electricity into the grid, and thereby affecting the supply. So next one, please. So we had a very successful community meeting with local businesses. Awareness was raised, the biggest challenge, the grid connection, and we're waiting for new opportunities to move forward. The power industry, which we talked about earlier in the UK, is substantially owned by non-UK organisations. Their interest is their shareholder interests, and of course that's legitimate. But of course, if you wish to change supply arrangements, then you have to deal with them and their own planning arrangements. So we are waiting to see what we can do with those. I'm given to believe in this place and other places, the power industries are also seeking to become greener by building their own solar agendas and other renewable sources of energy. So let's move on. And in terms of just questions to raise, I didn't realize the time has moved so quickly. These are some of the things that go through your brain. What do you think growth and development means to you? What's a significant infrastructure challenges? What role does education play in meeting those things? Who can make the biggest changes? How can communities shape change in their area? Those are some starts of the challenges. I'll finish there and just say, I'll open it up to a discussion briefly. Okay. Anything people?
Do you want this
Anybody
on
want
screen, Clive?
Yeah, you can do. Anybody want to add anything or say anything or challenge anything?
Thanks for that, Clive. That's very comprehensive, but it just shows you how complex and integrated everything is. I mean, and it's particularly relevant to discussions at the moment, which political discussions where you're looking at either growth in some form or whether you should be looking at that through sort of energy issues or infrastructure issues, which will help improve our reduce the amount of reliability on fossil fuels. so it's difficult to know where to go with this. It's such a big topic, and how do you tackle it? I mean, how are we getting on with that community project? Is that going to be something which is going to happen?
From where we are at the moment, we are still awaiting whether in fact there can be a grid connection. If there isn't, then it's about local businesses doing something or something is done on the site. My conversation with the landowner, the farmer, is that if there is anything done that that enables green energy to be produced and used, and it replaces other forms of energy source, then I'd be happy for that to happen. I think there's issues that we are, by working in partnership, we are working in terms of a planning framework with planning consent that will be hopefully something that could be moved forward. But of course, in terms of the new agendas, certainly in this country around green energy, there are obviously new emerging arrangements happening. So we'll just have to wait and see. In the biggest context, as you said, David, that where the previous speaker we talked about, we had a session on circular economy from Uche Ugwu. Big business is waking up to the fact that unless they start to think about their responsibility in terms of circularity, and in terms of even then tied in with the notion of this the donut economic model, people will say to me, or people tell me that if you read the stuff, they're on a downhill slope. They need to address this to survive down the line. I think the previous head of the Bank of England has just spoken about that even in the last week. You need to adapt, you need to change for your own business survival. It's imperative for them. So yes, at all sorts of levels, things need to be addressed. The purpose of our presentation tonight is to put out there to generate thinking.
A big topic, very big, but fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you were in your, as I understand it, David, you were involved in all sorts of aspects around chemical education or chemistry education. Was ever this talked about in the days past as being important?
Not really. I can remember in my early days of teaching, we followed an Open University program, which was basically to look at when would we run out of fossil fuels. And with students, we took all the information about oil production and so on. It was an estimate. But I think the date that we worked out when there'll be no fossil fuels left to be used was something like 1999. And
yep.
Of course, what had happened is that technology improved, and over the years, methods of extracting oil and fossil fuels improved, and they were being produced in much greater numbers than expected. More discoveries were made. But that was at that time, I'm talking now about 40, 50 years ago, you're looking really at it's going to be terrible when the Earth runs out of fossil fuels. There'll be a disaster. Then, of course, came the idea of global warming, and that took a long time to really people to take that seriously, and then realize that it wasn't about fossil fuels. It was about the dangers of destroying the world. So, yeah, there wasn't that sort of thinking at all. It was more about, it's going to be terrible if we run out, we can't get petrol in our car. That's the end of the world.
Yep. Yeah. And
So,
in terms of the for those of us that have younger members of our families, to what extent is this debate or these challenges part of their life in what they do in their work or in their own thinking?
probably not. I mean, because it's the everyday, am I going to get to work today? What do I need to do to feed the kids? And then suddenly you find prices go up, or and the sort of situation we have now, that becomes a dominant factor. It's very difficult to stand back and see the bigger picture, or to actually get the leadership there. I mean, you can see what of the information we're getting, but there's no clear strategy for this.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to chip in with thoughts or views?
I suppose the bit that's interesting for me, Clive, in all of this is the potential for tension between what we want to do at a national level and what we want to do at a local level. Yeah, I regularly watch our local news here, and I doubt there is more than a couple of nights go by when I don't watch something where somebody's objecting to the development of renewable energy sources. You know, only the other night on Look North, the debate was between releasing land for solar use versus needing that land for food production. I think we've got some very difficult planning issues to try and work through on this. And I don't know how much national direction needs to be given from central government versus local wishes and all of this. I think that's a real serious issue that needs to be worked through.
Okay.
I think that goes back, but to the other things you raised, that you've got to look at the bigger picture in terms of if you do convert land to solar panels, what are the disadvantages of that? I mean, that sounds a great idea, but what else would happen? What follow on would that be in terms of not being able to use the land properly, or it's very complicated and not easy to understand.
Okay. Any comments, Steve?
Well, I just think it's a fascinating, really wide-reaching topic, isn't it? Quite a philosophical one tonight. I think that sort of central question, that sort of the difference between growth and development, it's kind of, you know, it ran all the way through your presentation, didn't it? It's really at the heart of this debate. It's not something that we are conditioned really to think about, is it? It's not something that when the government talks about growth, they're clearly talking about economic growth. When we talk about whether it's the developing countries and sort of how they're influenced by, you know, sort of Western hegemony, if you want to call it that, it's about growth in the economic sense, it seems, in terms of what you have. That's how we're very much judged, isn't it? It's kind of, you know, what car you have and your house and whatever else. It just does seem that that's the marker still. And, you know, that's when we talk about young people, and I was interested in your section on the IT and the sort of the, you know, sort of the how that's sort of structured. I think, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but the way that you know, sort of technology, you know, sort of information is that we gather that now, you know, sort of through social media and TikTok. It's not just the firms that dominate, it's the algorithms that present information to you. So if you're in a particular, you know, sort of bubble and you think a certain way, then you'll see more of that information. It's very difficult to get out of those sort of ways of thinking. And, you know, I do think that's the biggest challenge, to sort of look at your sort of quality of life issues over pure economic growth. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to think that way. There were some really interesting and powerful examples in your presentation there. You know, sort of, it's quite telling, isn't it, when we're talking about the debate between, you know, we talked about solar and you know, versus food production, all the rest. We're not really talking about demand reduction in any way. There's a report out last week, I think it was, to the House of Lords Committee, talking about what we need to do in this country as a nation to tackle climate change, and a lot of that comes down to behaviour change. And behaviour change can mean sort of the way we think about things, the way we consume. But it's quite telling, isn't it, that the government aren't So even at a time when, as a nation, we need to be, you think we'd be pulling together, the threats of blackouts potentially and rising energy bills, we're still not talking about, the government's not talking about kind of insulation, are they? It's more, what can we do to grow and not change what we're doing almost. So yeah, it's really made me think tonight, and I hope it has to sort of anyone watching as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we've about reached our limit, Bert, have we?
I think so, Clive. Yeah.
And just to say thank you for being there and being part of this. And of course, this is available online down the line for others to use and find information through it. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time in November.